You weren't paying attention to him.
No, I'm not supposed to be there. That my dog knows my routine.
Sorry, we are now live to YouTube. Thank you. You can go ahead, Councilor Martin.
Thank you. Good evening, members of the committee and members of the public. I now call the Vision Zero Road Safety Committee meeting to order. This meeting is being held electronically due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll go over some of the rules of procedure for the benefit of members and the viewing public. The meeting is being streamed live by the City of Brantford YouTube account. All members of the community will be muted upon entering the meeting and throughout when they are not speaking in order to reduce background noise. All web cameras for committee members shall be left turned on throughout the meeting. If a member needs to leave their seat, please leave the camera on so we recognize you are away. Staff will be requested to join the video meeting should they need to answer questions of members. Movers and seconders of motions shall be indicated by raising your hand on camera, and the chair will call out who the mover and seconder are. All members of the committee participating by online video conference will vote by a physical show of hands. In the event a connection service interruption occurs that affects quorum of the Committee of Adjustment, we may recess the meeting for up to 15 minutes to regain quorum. If quorum is not achieved, the meeting will be adjourned. Attendance will now be noted by the clerk.
The attendance has been taken.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Seeing none, we have no delegations for tonight's meeting. We have one item for consideration on our agenda, which includes a presentation. First item is 4.1 red light camera feasibility study update. Okay, I believe IBI has a presentation to make.
Hi, good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm Gagan Batra, Senior Project Manager, Special Projects in the Public Works Commission, and I have with me Matt Colwell and Stefan Zhang from IBI Group. They're going to go through this red light camera feasibility study presentation, after which we will be happy to take any questions.
All right. Thanks, Gagan. My name is Matt Colwell. I'm the project manager for the red light camera feasibility study being conducted on behalf of the City of Brantford. And as Gagan noted, I have our project engineer, Stefan Zhang, here with me. If you want to switch to the next slide, I'll take you through the brief outline of our presentation. We're going to start with the project objectives, touch a little bit on the red light camera that exists today in the province of Ontario, talk about the municipal scan that we conducted as part of this study, as well as the data analysis, the construction of the site selection methodology, the preliminary site selection, next steps and discussion that we're all here to talk about today. Next slide, project objectives. Okay, moving on. There are three objectives for this project. First is to conduct a scan of municipalities that are participating in the red light camera program to determine the benefits and challenges of implementation based on their experiences, to identify rank signalized intersections within Brantford that could benefit from the implementation of red light cameras, and to identify the process, timelines, and high-level costs of red light camera implementation. Next slide. All right, so I'll start with a quick overview of the red light camera program. It's been around for over 20 years now. It started with legislation that was passed in 1998. There was an initial pilot study. Through the successes of that pilot study, the program was formally adopted for permanent use. Over the course of its existence, there's been periodic addition of new municipalities to the program, which I think is a testament to the successes and that have been observed by those participating in the program. And as you can see, there's a handful of new municipalities: Sudbury, Guelph, Kingston, Niagara region, and Windsor that are about to join the program in the near future. Next slide. This slide just shows the distribution of red light cameras across the province. Far and away, the municipality with the greatest number of red light cameras is the City of Toronto, and they have more than 300 of them working today. In Ottawa, the second most populous for red light cameras, they have 69. But you can also see that some of the municipalities that have recently or will soon join the program, namely Guelph, Niagara region, have as few as 6 cameras. So there's a pretty wide spectrum of the number of cameras that are being used by various municipalities. Next slide, please. All right, so how does this technology work? First and foremost, the signage indicating that red light cameras are in use at a given intersection are posted on all approaches. However, a camera, flash unit, and vehicle detection technologies are installed only on the approach or approaches, typically with the highest frequency of red light running. So in most instances, it's only one approach per intersection, although all are signed. And so the way that the system works is that 2 photos are taken of vehicles that are violating the red light. The first photo is taken is when the vehicle is entering the intersection after the red light has, or just before the red light has gone into phase. And then the second photo shows the vehicle proceeding through the intersection with that red light still in phase. Next slide, please. After the violation is recorded by the camera system, the photos are sent to the Joint Processing Center, which is operated by the City of Toronto. Staff there review the photos to authenticate the violations and request vehicle ownership information from the Ministry of Transportation. At that point, a letter is sent to the vehicle owner as legislated within 23 days of the violation. There are no demerit points associated with violations under the red light camera program. But the vehicle owners are charged a total of $325, of which $260 goes to the municipality in which the violation occurred. But that amount, or at least the amount that actually ends up going into the coffers of the municipality, can be reduced by prosecutors if the violation is contested. Next slide, please. So implementation steps. I mean, the first step really is to get council approval to proceed with the expenditures and entering into the agreements that are required in order to participate in the program. There are 3 agreements that must be entered into by any municipality that wants to participate in the red light camera program. One with the Ministry of Transportation, which is primarily about data access and being included in legislation. One with the Joint Processing Center to actually process the violations and issue them to the vehicle owners. And the third is with the camera vendor who supply, install, and operate the technology. The vendor, as part of their process of installing the technology, conducts site visits to determine the feasibility, mostly based on the physical characteristics of the intersection, things like sight lines, pavement condition, and any other obstructions that might prevent the systems from working properly. And then once the installation is completed by the vendor, the red light camera signage can go in and they can begin to operate them and issue violation offenses. Next slide, please. All right, so in trying to better understand the experience of participating in the program, we conducted a municipal scan of all of the participating municipalities and those who are about to join the program to learn also about, the upfront part of the process. And so one of the things that we asked about was how they select the sites for red light camera installation. And all of the municipalities who responded indicated that the primary criteria that they considered was the frequency and severity of angle or T-bone collisions. And that's the primary collision type that red light cameras are intended to prevent. They also looked at the frequency and severity of rear-end collisions, because in some instances, rear-end collision frequencies have been seen to go up after the installation of red light cameras. And so, that's also a consideration when selecting sites. And as most of these programs are operated within municipalities that have some sort of strategic road safety program or Vision Zero program, the involvement of vulnerable road users, pedestrians, cyclists, and motorcyclists in collisions at signalized intersections is also a big factor in deciding where red light cameras should go. And because of the physical constraints and the feasibility around the system installations, a lot of municipalities that we surveyed suggested that, even if you have a target number of cameras that you want to install, you should have a longer list of potential sites, because not everywhere is going to be suitable for the installation of the equipment. Next slide, please. All right, another big component of the municipal scan was trying to understand the costs associated with participating in the program. And so, as you can see on this slide, the costs were not the same for every municipality that responded. So we have a range for each of the component items listed here, which include the camera vendor fee, the joint processing center contribution fee, MTO database fees, site installation, or maybe better phrase, site preparation costs, court costs, administrative costs and equipment, and education for the public about the program. Now, some of these costs are directly linked to the number of cameras and the number of violations that make up your program. Like you can see, there's a fixed cost per infraction for access to the MTO data. The camera vendor fee is basically a daily rate per camera, depending on when in the contract a municipality enters into the agreement. Other fees, such as the site preparation costs, really just depend on the state of good repair for the intersection when it is selected for inclusion in the program. So maybe there's a bit of pavement condition that needs to be improved, pavement markings or signage, et cetera, that need to be upgraded before the cameras can be operated. And then things like the education, it's a mandatory requirement for participation in the program set up by the province. So monies are spent there upfront and then in all following years of the program. Next slide, please. So when we spoke to them about costs, we also asked the participating municipalities about revenues. And so the first thing that they told us is that, they've been really successful in generating revenues from the program because 98% of the violations go uncontested. And so, from each violation, they're collecting the $260, except for in the couple of percentage points where they're having those fines reduced through the contestant and the prosecutors. What that translates into is an approximately 0.7 to 1 tickets per day per site mark for break even. And I know it may be hard to conceptualize 0.7 tickets per day, but really what that translates to is about somewhere between 250, 260 violations per year at a camera in order for that break-even point to be met. And most municipalities noted that they cover operational costs through the ticket revenues. But just in terms of the optics of the program, they suggested that red light cameras should be viewed first and foremost as a city initiative. The city should be willing to take on the cost to operate those programs. Revenues, if the programs are successful, will decrease because violations will be less frequent, but the cost of operating the program will remain largely constant. The per violation variable costs obviously would go down. And then in a lot of instances also, they suggested that revenue should be directed towards a general road safety fund, where the monies in that fund could be used to pay for the operating costs of the red light camera program, but also be redirected towards other safety initiatives, showing a direct link between the money that's being collected and it being expended on road safety. Next slide, please. So based on the cost and revenue numbers ranges that we got from the participating municipalities, we put together a bit of a model, a low end and a high end estimate of some of the annual cost, assuming a 6-camera program. As you might recall, that's the number of cameras that Guelph has entered into the program with, and staff suggested that would be a good benchmark to start with in trying to estimate the costs and revenues for Brantford. So, there's a range of capital costs, like we said, for site preparation. There's the operating cost, which includes things like the camera lease fees, the education programs, et cetera, that vary from year to year, depending on when one enters into the contract with the camera providers. We've estimated the total 5-year costs for those elements, also shown here, along with the average annual costs. Assuming 1 violation per camera per day and a 98% uncontest rate, you can see that under both scenarios, we're approximating $558,000 annually in revenue. And in both cases, that represents a surplus over the average annual cost. And so over the 5-year analysis period, both the low end and the high end estimate result in a total surplus based on the violation rates that we've assumed. Next slide, please. All right, so further breaking down the way in which those assumed revenues can be assigned to the various costs associated with the program, right? Like I said, we've assumed average annual revenue of $558,000, and selecting the midpoint between the two, the high end and the low end cost schemes, it represents an average annual cost of $481,000, and therefore an annual surplus of $77,600. And then the pie chart on the left here shows where the different proportional expenditures of those revenues are incurred, including the surplus at 14%. Next slide, please. All right, so the data analysis, move on. We had 3 sources of data that we looked at as part of the study, all provided by city staff, and they consisted of a list of signalized intersections, collision data for the period from 2015 through 2020, so a total of 6 calendar years, and city collected traffic volumes, average annual daily traffic volumes for roadways from 2020 calendar year. Next slide, please. All right, so when we looked in detail at the collision data that we were provided, we saw that there were just over 10,000 collisions across the city within that 6-year analysis period, and of those, approximately 40% occurred at signalized intersections. So we took a closer look at that subset of collisions, that 4,053 collisions that occurred at signalized intersections. And roughly 9% of those collisions were angle collisions or T-bone collisions, the kind that are most closely associated with red light cameras. And that is that red light cameras are designed to prevent those collisions from happening by further discouraging drivers from entering into the intersection on a red light when traffic traveling in a perpendicular cross direction might be there lawfully. Next slide, please. And so a big part of why this program is successful in terms of generating a safety benefit is that red light cameras have been shown to reduce angle collisions by about 25%. And as I noted earlier, they've also been shown at some locations to increase rear end collisions by about 15%. But as you can see from the data on the left here, and this is taken from the Brantford collision data, that angle collisions are 30% of the time they generate a fatal or injury outcome versus rear end collisions where only 10% of the time do they result in a fatal or injury outcome. So the net safety benefit of installing red light cameras, even when we account for the potential increase in rear end collisions, is still quite significant, simply because we're talking about the most severe type of vehicle collisions that are generally happening on our roadways. I mean, we can see here that vehicle pedestrian and vehicle cyclist collisions account for a very high proportion of fatalities and injuries. And that's another reason why locations that experience those collision types are taken into consideration when selecting red light camera installation sites. Next slide, please. And so when we evaluated sites within the city for as potential candidates for red light camera installation, at least initially, the primary criteria that we considered was the number of red light running collisions that occurred on a given approach. Given that most cases, the red light camera is only installed on one approach to the intersection, that was sort of the benchmark that we used, right? And so if there was a discrepancy between a large number of red light camera collisions or red light running collisions occurred at one intersection, but they were fairly evenly spread out amongst the 3 or 4 approaches to the intersection, that might have persuaded us to look at a different intersection where like the bulk of the red light running collisions were concentrated on a single approach. Secondary criteria that we looked at, as I noted again, rear end collisions by frequency and severity. and the geographic distribution of the potential red light camera sites across the city. A lot of the municipalities that we spoke to mentioned this quote unquote halo effect or spillover effect, that, you know, signing the red light cameras and having them be present at a variety of locations throughout the city had in at least anecdotally improving compliance with red lights across their municipalities. And so I think, as I said before, in consultation with city staff, we targeted 6 preliminary sites for red light camera installation. Next slide, please. And again, those are all subject to vetting and approval by the camera vendors. So this slide lists the by approach, the intersections that experience the highest frequency of red light running collisions over the analysis period. And you can see that there were quite a few that experienced 5 or more red light running collisions on a given approach throughout the 6-year period. The intersection of Clarence Street at Dalhousie Street, for those who are paying close attention, you might notice that it in fact had 3 of the top 4 approaches in the city. And so that wasn't the only criteria that we looked at, right? Wanting to spread this out, not have all of the eggs in one basket, so to speak. We also looked at the percentage of fatal and injury collisions that occurred at each of these intersections, as well as the total number of red light running collisions that occurred at the intersection. And therefore, we didn't just select the top 6 approaches, but we selected 6 intersections, taking into serious consideration the ranking by approach, as well as the fatal and injury percentage of the overall intersection. So I think the next slide shows us what some of this looks like on a map. And so I think it comes pretty quickly into focus that a lot of those top approaches in terms of frequency of red light running collisions are concentrated in Ward 5. And so if we had only selected the top 6 approaches, we wouldn't have gotten very good geographic coverage across the city with those cameras. But what is encouraging is that, you know, I mean, if we want to look at it that way, that there is an opportunity to target intersections that have had at least 5 red light running collisions on a given approach, and have those located across the city, representing each ward, or at least one of the boundary roads that define the wards across the city. Next slide, please. And so our preliminary list of recommended sites for installation, and I think that, you know, the geographic coverage as illustrated on the right here is really good. It include Clarence at Dalhousie, northbound approach, Dundas at West Street, northbound approach, Blackburn Drive at Veterans Memorial Parkway, eastbound approach, St. Paul Ave at Terrace Hill Street, westbound approach, Fairview Drive at West Street, eastbound approach, and Wayne Gretzky Parkway at Henry Street, southbound approach. And again, can't emphasize enough that these are just preliminary recommendations, and they're all subject to the feasibility, the physical characteristic assessment by the camera vendor. All right, so I think that is it for the content of our presentation, but we're more than happy to engage in a discussion and answer any questions you might have about the work that we've done today.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a mover and a seconder to put this on the floor? Councillor Van Tilburg, Councillor Utley. Questions? Councillor Van Tilburg, you have the floor.
Okay, so your initial list then it starts by the for locations is based on the city's record of collisions.
Yes, that's the primary criteria.
All right, I find that interesting. I mean, that's a good methodology. It's one of the places that always appears to me as a focal point is the St. Paul Brant Ave intersection, which is very blind, certainly problematic if there is a collision. I mean, I thought this has been a lot of city effort put at that corner, so perhaps those efforts have been very effective. When I'm looking at Clarence and Dalhousie Street, actually I'm looking at, I guess I get to look at a lot of them in the ward. Are you, is the intent to make the approaches to these red lights 40 kilometers?
We didn't discuss any changes to existing speed limits, posted speed limits, as part of the scope of our study. There may be parallel initiatives that address that issue, but the current posted speed limit on those on any of the roadways or approaches wasn't a factor in identifying candidate sites.
Do we change the light timing for the cameras?
There's no requirement to change the timings. I mean, they should be, you know, consistent with all of the you know, posted speeds, etc. We haven't, again, investigated what the current timings are, as that wasn't part of the scope of this exercise.
I just want to know if the times for the lights to be on and off change, because that also becomes problematic at certain times. I guess my other question is, when these are installed, and you've kind of got a bread chart for revenue streams in that, what, taking one of the more busy cameras, say in Hamilton, when they implemented the red light camera, what is the decrease at the busiest? So of the 30 some odd cameras in Hamilton, one of them obviously will be high for red light offenses and possibly collisions. That one there, what is the difference in the decrease in offenses at the red light camera and the decreases in collisions and offenses? What would that would be?
Okay, so I'll first speak to just what we heard generally, and we don't have information as part of this study about any specific locations. The generally reported decrease in angle collisions associated with the installation of red light cameras is about 25%.
Yeah, that wasn't my question. No, I was more or less, see, that could be on a broader and an overall, right? And perhaps in the greater good of things, on the grand scope that's helpful. I was kind of comparing to, say, the St. Paul Brant Ave, is to see what happens. Say you have a very problematic intersection and the red light camera did that solve the problem? And I guess then your study doesn't take that into account. That is not something that we would find out until after the fact. In other words, we could put up a red light camera and still have the same number of offenses or recurring offenses or collisions. Still a possibility, correct?
I mean, if you want me to provide an expert opinion on this, I mean, the possibility exists that there could be no.
Yeah, that's all. I just didn't know. I thought you might be sitting on something like saying, no, in every single case of the 30 cameras, it went down and it went down this amount. I mean, that would be fantastic to have that information. So with regards to, are we stuck to the list of streets on here? Or could such a location, such as the St. Paul Brant Ave corner, where even though there is a sign, there is still a lot of violations on the right-hand turn there. I mean, a cop could sit there and just milk that one day and night.
Right, and this list is by no means final. I mean, I think that's really where I can settle on that. And as I've said all along, you know, even the locations that we've recommended are subject to final approval by the vendor.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Utley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Matt. Matt, thank you for your presentation. I have a question with regard to slide 15, which was the costs and revenues of setting up a red light camera system. And I wanted to ask, are these best case scenarios, or are they an average of what's actually happening on the ground?
Yeah, and so the information presented in this slide 15, or in slide 15 as it was presented, is based on what we heard as feedback from the municipal scan. And so, as you may recall, we got a range of different costs associated with each of the cost components. We took the low end cost, we took the high end cost, and we essentially built two models with that. Where we've taken a little bit of liberty is about the violation rate, and one violation per camera per day. And that number isn't inconsistent with what we heard from the municipalities. We heard some report on average as much as 1.5 violations per camera per day, more, down around the 1.1, 1.2 range. So, I mean, I think that it's a pretty realistic estimate.
Thank you. And just one follow-up question, and Councillor Van Tilburg, I think raises. So if you come up to a red light with a no right turn, or is that a red light camera offense?
Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure whether or not that violation would be captured, and
Okay.
some of it depends on the nature of the lane. If it's a red or a right turn lane alone, it may not even be monitored. Some of the technology required vehicles to be traveling at a minimum speed in order to trigger the offense, and so if they're just rolling through, they may or may not be captured. So it's a little unclear, and there may be opportunities to specify violations like that working with the vendor to be captured.
I think
sorry,
that would
Matt.
be
Oh, sorry. I was just going to call on Dave Ferguson to answer that because he has some experience from Hamilton with their red light camera program.
Yeah,
he might be able to answer that. Dave.
thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just to answer the question, yeah, so if a right turn vehicle is turning on the red light, they will not get a violation. There is a built-in system to it, and it recognizes that they're turning right, and they will not receive a violation. And
the likelihood of a serious accident turning slowly at a red light on, as a no right turn, that probably wouldn't get far in court. So I just wanted to clarify that. We could make a lot of money on that if that were the case. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, David and Matt.
Mayor Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is probably a question that you might want to ask, but Matt, we had a presentation at the Police Services Board earlier this year, a group called, I think, Bus Patrol, and they specialize in a camera system that catches people driving past the bus stopped and has all the warning signals, and then sends an electronic ticket. And we asked them at the meeting, are you going to be doing this for like speed control and red light? And they said yes, although I've not really seen anything since then that says they are. Are you aware of any? So that leads me to my question. Are there any competing systems besides this one?
Right. My understanding that the current contract was let via a competitive bidding process through the Joint Processing Center under City of Toronto procurement, and there was only one successful bidder, and they are the only provider to the existing JPC. So any other providers, I mean, they wouldn't have a contract with the JPC, and so there would be, a lot of other logistical nuance associated with using a different provider. So beyond that, there's not really much I can say on it, other than the fact that there's only one provider contracted with the Joint Processing Center.
Okay. And so this contracted provider, are they also the same provider of services for the speed control cameras?
I'm not aware of the contract that exists on between the different providers in the JPC. Maybe Stefan, do you have any details on that?
Yeah, with the automated speed enforcement, it's a separate vendor from the one that is currently administering the red light cameras.
Okay. Great.
And I think that we did have some questions about some specific vendors, and when we did a bit of background research, it turned out that one was actually a subsidiary of the other, so they're in fact basically the same entity. But clearly that's not the case with red light and automated speed enforcement.
Great. Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Vanderstel, you have the floor.
Thank you for the first time. Appreciate it. Through you to Matt, is there a life cycle on these cameras? And if so, who does the replacement at whose cost?
Yeah, I mean, I like any piece of field equipment, right? They're subject to wear and tear and depreciation and all that. And so through the program as it exists today, ownership of all of that equipment remains with the vendor. And it's really just a leasing scheme that exists between the or agreement that exists between the municipality and the camera vendor. And so the camera vendor is responsible for making sure that the equipment out there is functional and doing what it's supposed to do.
For the 5-year life cycle, regardless of loss, damage, stolen, or defective material?
As far as I understand, for the term of the contract, and that may not be exactly 5 years, depending on when the municipality enters into the agreement. But for the duration of their agreement, yeah, that's the vendor's responsibility.
Okay, and considering the 3 top most tragic choices in the scan, Clarence DeLuzzi, I have a twofold question on that one. Is there any data coming from that suggests to you that we should go above and beyond the current number that are suggested for the city of Brantford, higher so than Guelph, let's say? I'll let you answer that one first.
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of nuance. It would seem that there could be other candidate sites based strictly on the number of violations, and that that there's probably more than 6 sites that would derive a benefit from red light camera installation. That said, we will need to first find out what the viability of the 6 recommended sites is before we would consider moving on to any further down the list. And then also, there are some capacity constraints around the number of violations that the program would generate and sort of the downstream workflows with that. And so I think the number 6 was selected, not just to parallel what Guelph is doing, but also to be conscious of those other, resource constraints associated with operating the program and not wanting to generate perhaps too many violations right out of the gate.
Okay, and one more additional question, Mr. Chair, through you to Matt. Understandably, based on who I'm seeing on the screen right now, there's a number of people here who have had extensive experience over the last 10 years with this type of product and this type of a study. Have you seen such a pronounced choke point as demonstrated by Coburn and DeLuzzi?
I mean, it wasn't part of this study for us to do what we call an in-service safety review of that intersection. So I don't know a lot about how it functions outside of the number of collisions and the number of red light running collisions specifically that have occurred there. But I have looked at a lot of intersections over the years, and there's often many factors at play when we see higher concentrations of collisions like this, right? It may not just be willful disobedience with the signals outright.
Could you call it statistically significant, this corner?
I think the frequency, just strictly anecdotally without running it against any statistical comparators, it seems pretty high. And it's worth note that it's high on multiple approaches, so that there may be some other things at play here.
That's right. Understood. Okay. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Carpenter, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Excellent report, by the way. Very lengthy, but excellent report. You got a lot of detail in there. I really appreciate it. And I even appreciate the 6 that you recommended, trying to spread them out throughout the city. A couple of questions. So you talk about the camera vendor having final approval. What does that mean, final approval?
Right. It basically comes down to them saying that, as the intersection exists today, they can or can't install their equipment and have it function appropriately. Some of the barriers to that installation may be simple fixes, things over which the municipality has control and can take action. Other things, whether like maybe it's a road grade with that doesn't provide sufficient sight lines or something of that nature. Maybe it's not so easy to fix. And so really, when we say they get final approval, it's them coming in and saying, realistically, can we operate our equipment here the way that it's supposed to work?
Not doable. So again, this would take about 18 to 24 months and to install. Is that what I read in the report? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think generally the feedback that we got was somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 24 months from council agreement to proceed to actually getting the system up and running.
And what's the timeline for council having to sign on, like to make this decision?
There's an opportunity to enter into the contract in its current structure, as I understand it, at basically any point over the course of the contract with the vendor. I don't know that that was always the case with some of the previous agreements.
Right.
However, the cost to enter into the contract in terms of the daily lease rates for the camera equipment do vary over the life of the contract, and the longer one waits to enter, the higher those daily rates generally are.
Okay, and when we looked at these sites, particularly Clarence and Dalhousie location, we have in our engineering planning work that in that intersection, for example, to have double turning lanes there. In fact, we maintained the property on the other side to change that intersection. So was that part of the review as well when we looked at those, at the future review of how those that turning lane will be adjusted or maintained?
No, anything beyond the strict occurrence of collisions was outside of the purview of this study. There definitely could be impacts of that or other work that would change the geometry or the operations of the intersection.
Okay, so if we went ahead with the 6 sites, do we have the ability to move them to other sites?
I'm sure that there's a cost associated with it. There is no, I think, anything that would prevent you from selecting different sites over the course of the contract. I don't know what the cost would be.
Okay, we'd have
It
to be
sounds like maybe David Ferguson can provide a bit more info on that.
Thank you.
Yes, through the chair. So once you've installed a location, you are set to that location. If you wish to move it, there is a contractual price to actually remove it to a different location.
Do we have any idea what, ballpark idea what that might be?
Through the chair, I don't have that information in front of me right now.
Yeah, because I'm thinking if Clarence and Dalhousie Street does get double turn lanes, I mean, the problem with the red light there is people turning left, heading into West Brant, or turning right, leaving West Brant on Coburn Street side. But if we were to make adjustments to that intersection and do the double turn lanes, that would change the whole dynamic of that corner. And I don't know when that is necessarily or how fast we would do that, but I would just have some concern about giving us the flexibility of whether we use that site or not. If we're looking at change, we have to look at our capital plan, I think, at the same time, I would guess. I guess that, oh yes, what the other thing is the 18 to 24 months, what would be the timeline? Would that give us enough time to speak to the public about red light cameras at these particular locations and what the public's thought are on red light cameras, and we can inform them of the ticket price that they would see and so forth?
Yeah, there's no requirement, as I know it, to consult with the public before moving forward with something like this, which is different than the mandatory education component, which would probably include the elements that you suggested, informing the public about where the cameras would be located, and the various fines and such associated with violations, and I don't see any reason why 12 to 24 months wouldn't provide sufficient time to provide that education.
Yeah, but that would we'd already be locked into a program and providing education rather than asking what people thought. That be true?
Yeah, and I don't know that there would be I don't know if there's anything that precludes consultation be outside of the mandatory public education. And timelines for that are really subject to your desire to provide opportunity for input.
Okay, one more quick question then. Back to that ability to choose locations. We don't have to make that decision on these locations today then. Would that be correct?
Correct. And again, even if we had consensus that these were the top 6 choices, we don't have confirmation that they're all viable from the vendor perspective.
And maybe from our engineering department's perspective on what they're going to do with some intersections, for example. I mean, we know Dundas and West isn't going to change. Blackburn Drive is not going to change. The only one I'm concerned about here is Clarence and that change. But I would just like to make sure engineering has got plans for. We've had plans for a long time to fix that intersection. I don't know if it's actually going to happen or not. So, all right, thank you for your work. It's an excellent report.
Thank you.
Okay, before I go to second time speakers, I got a few questions. Will the red light camera affect turning movement accidents?
I would anticipate that there could be an impact. I can't speak to any specific published values on the impact of red light cameras on violations or collisions other than the angle collisions. There may be some numbers that we could dig up on what we call collision modification factors associated with this treatment that look at all collisions at an intersection. But I don't know that we would have anything that speaks specifically to the impact of red light cameras on turning movement collisions.
Okay. Has there been any discussion about vandalism to the cameras themselves?
That wasn't noted by the responding municipalities as being a major issue, perhaps to the extent that we might have seen in the media with respect to the automated speed enforcement cameras. One of the reasons for that might be that the camera units themselves are housed at I think about 3.5 meters off the ground, so they're a little bit less accessible. The other is they may not have the same connotations associated with them as some other automated enforcement equipment might, in terms of their utility and people's opinions of it.
Okay, and you said the ticket was 350 and we get 260 of that. Where does the other 90 go?
Yeah, I think the numbers were 325 and 260.
Okay.
But the difference goes to a victim surcharge that is administered by the province, as I understand it, as well as just the cost to serve the violation notice.
Okay. Mayor Davis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Matt, a couple questions. One, assuming this resolution passes here, then of course it goes to committee of the whole. And would you be making a presentation at committee of the whole so that the public, there's a greater public awareness of what we have in mind here?
Through the chair, yes, they're going to be presenting at committee of the whole as well.
Okay, so on a completely different matter, right at the end of the report, and this is part of recommendation E, is you gave us the high level overview of the automated speed camera system. And although people on our community, I think, would say, yeah, we got a problem with people who run red lights, probably you would hear more from people who think we've got a speeding problem through our city. And the people here, residents hear about this camera system being in place in other communities. And I think there's a growing frustration how long it's taking for the city to take a serious look at that and move forward with a speed enforcement type program. So when I looked at the report, you gave us a very high level overview, and you did say, and in fact, E talks about taking the surplus funds from this red light camera program and using that to started analyzing the issue of community safety zones, which of course is the underlying justification for speed enforcement cameras, which is you got to have community safety zones, right? But your report also says, should council wish a more thorough analysis of costs, preliminary site selection, staff can provide details of the expected cost of the study at a future Vision Zero Road Safety Committee meeting. So for that to come to us at the next meeting, do we need to add an F to this resolution?
Through the chair, yes. So the direction we were given was to use that additional fund for, or that entire fund for red light camera. And since we had the available funding, we decided to use it for the community safety zone, which is why the E is there, based on the resolution that Councillor Vanderstelt brought forward. But if council wishes us to do that study on the automated speed enforcement, we would need to have additional funding for that.
Yeah, what you said in this report was if you want to know more about that and the cost, et cetera, we can give you a more thorough analysis of that, similar to what you do with the red light cameras, but you can do it at the next meeting. So I assume that's not a cost. Staff would just do that thorough analysis for us, so we can then make a decision fairly quickly on speed enforcement cameras, right?
Through the chair, yes. We were planning on doing the community safety zones anyhow, which is closely related to the automated speed enforcement. However, should council wish for us to fast track the automated speed enforcement, that would be another recommendation.
Okay, with that in mind, Mr. Chair, can I put forward an amendment seeking a seconder at this time?
Looks like Councillor Vanderstelt's going to second that for you.
Yeah, okay, so the amendment would be that we add as F to the resolution that staff provide us at our next Future Vision Zero Road Safety Committee meeting a more thorough analysis of the, I'll make sure I got this right, more thorough analysis of the costs. Oh my God. Sorry, I want to go right to the report here. Looking around here. Yeah, I'm going right out of page 18. So a more thorough analysis of the ACE program, the expected costs of joining and preliminary site selection, and staff to provide details of the expected cost of such a study. I'm kind of cobbling that together from 9.7 section, first paragraph 9.7 of the report that we received today. Which in essence is, my understanding is that the next meeting we'll get a more thorough analysis and give us some details as to, you know, what the cost would be to do, I guess it's very almost identical to, very similar to what we've seen today on red light cameras.
Through the chair.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mayor Davis. Can I also mention that depending on the timeline we associate with that, the feedback that we've heard from the JPC and other cities who are joining the ASE program is that at this time, they're not accepting additional municipalities. So even if we were to do the site selection and go through that process, we wouldn't be able to join at this time. And there's no indication of when they're accepting municipalities, just because of the sheer volume of violations they're having to process and the capacity.
Yeah, but I'd say if we're anticipating what's going to happen, I mean, they're obviously going to deal with that, and I would assume they're going to overcome it. But if we keep delaying really moving forward the automatic speed enforcement, it's going to be another like year or two, and hopefully by the end of the year they'll get this resolved, and your more thorough analysis will tell us when that might likely happen. But you know, I'd really like, my personal opinion is I'd like to see us make some real progress on moving forward with automated speed enforcement. And this report wouldn't cost us any money. We're not committing anything, and it's just giving us a lot more information. So perhaps we might even be able to get it into the 2022 budget. So anyways, that's my amendment, Mr. Chair, and my pitch for it.
Yes, Indy.
Through you, Chair Martin, Mayor Davis, just clarification. Are we looking for a similar report as in the detailed report, or the cost of what it would take to actually provide a report? Like this was a consultant work, if we want, which took probably about 4 or so months to do. So the high level, and we had some money left over, so we were able to do a high level ASE. But if we want to dive into it deep, similar to something like this, we would probably need more time to do it than the next Vision Zero. I believe we meet quarterly, if I'm not correct.
Okay.
So we may need some more time to do that. I believe.
But to be clear, Andy, I'm not saying let's go forward and let's get a consultant and let's do this report, because I read your staff report to us to say, well, there's a step you want to take before you might want to do that, and that's us giving you a more detailed report as to what that would involve, what the cost would be, because obviously you'd have to have a consultant come in to do it, so what we did here. So it would be, so no, it's not that we launch out and do it, but because what you've given us is a very high level overview, but staff seem to acknowledge in this report in section 9.7, you wouldn't, based on this report, tell us to go ahead with getting a consultant. You need more information and we can get it for you for the next meeting.
Yes, that's more clear. So we can take that back.
Okay. Councillor Vanderstel, did you want to speak to the amendment or to the motion?
The motion, please. Thank you.
Okay, does anybody wish to speak to the amendment? Councillor Van Tilburg.
Yeah, the amendment sounds a little muddied right now. I'm not exactly clear on exactly what the amendment's asking for. I know what the kind of what you want to ask for, but what's actually in the amendment? What's the wording of the amendment?
Okay.
Do staff have that available to put on the screen?
So through the chair, what I've captured is that staff be directed to report back to the Vision Zero Road Safety Committee with further analysis of the cost of the ASE program. I just want to make sure that I captured everything that Mayor Davis was speaking about.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Seeing no further questions on the amendment, we'll call the question on the amendment. Are we doing e-scribe or show of hands, or what's the?
Just a physical show of hands, please.
All in favor of the amendment? Carries unanimously. On the motion as amended, Councillor Vanderstel.
Thank you. Through you to Matt again. What was it? 10,000 collisions reported over the last number of years that we had recorded?
Yeah, the data set that we received for the 2015 through 2020 calendar years included, I believe, 10,060 collisions.
Okay, so after the vendor approved locations, at what point does that happen in this timeline? When are they the ones that give the final approval to these locations? Does that happen shortly before installation, or will we have an idea of where those locations might be in the public consultation process?
Sorry, just toggling between windows. Yeah, I suspect that there would need to be an agreement in place before the vendor would commit the resources to exploring the feasibility of sites. So that may dictate some of the timing of that. There may be work that could be done in advance of that agreement being in place, but I don't know to what extent the vendor would be willing to participate.
Okay, so we have the data on the accident statistics now, collision statistics now on the intersections total. Okay, is there a way in which we might be able to use that information, share that information in our own public consultation process, so that people understand the true intent is, and not just create a cash grab here, but to ensure the safety of the intersections in question, so that we can prove later on, 5 years in, 3 years in, 2 years in, that we have reduced the amount of collisions in the intersections and thereby increase the level of safety in those intersections that are approved. Do we have access? Will we have access to that data? And can we share that data during the public consultation process?
I mean, as I see it, there's no limitations on sharing the data that are available today and that were available to us as part of this assessment. One thing that needs to be cautioned is that, the collision occurrences tend to fluctuate. They can fluctuate significantly from year to year. And we've definitely had some anomalous years of late. And so that could have impacts on what we see going forward. But I wouldn't see any restrictions on sharing the data that are available now and that inform this decision-making process.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Thanks for your work. Thank you.
Councilor Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, if this is successful, the revenue should decrease, should it not?
That would be in many respects the ideal outcome.
Is that we've seen experience by other municipalities that have red light cameras, that the actual cameras work so well that the revenue was decreased and therefore the cost increased to the city?
There were no reports of revenues decreasing from what we got back in the municipal scan to the point where they no longer covered the operating costs.
Okay, and the report talks about the $600,000 actually being returned to us in revenue by the red light cameras being successful. So why is item C asking for us to include that as an annual cost in the budget so that the $600,000 is there every year going forward, as opposed to one-time cost?
Right, and although we believe that these are realistic projections in terms of costs and revenues, there's a certain element of risk involved, right? That the cameras don't generate the number of violations that we've estimated, or that costs in one area or another, are slightly out of line with what we've estimated. And so in those instances, there's just a risk that things in reality will turn out to be different than what we've estimated. The other idea behind that, as it was suggested to us by those who responded to the municipal scan, is really one of speaking to red light cameras as being a fundamental safety initiative that the city supports regardless of the revenues that they generate. And so the idea behind it, as they've suggested, is that they commit to covering the cost to operate the program in the interest of public safety, and that when they do, if they do generate enough revenues from it to cover those operating costs, that's just a really fortuitous outcome, and in some instances it even generates enough for them to spend on other safety initiatives. But understanding that if it's really successful, the number of violations will go down, and with that revenues, they've committed to spending that amount annually in the interest of public safety.
Okay, so as part of the education process, teaching people that the yellow light action means stop if you can, not speed up. And would we change how we have we have the flashing sign that tells people, basically says to people, I know it's a don't walk sign, but what it really says to people is the yellow light's coming, you better speed up. So the process and how we do stop sign or traffic signals in the first place is causing some of the problems. Is there any change in that happening across the province anywhere? Or you wouldn't know?
Yeah, I mean, just based on what I know from industry, there's a lot of concerns about the types of reactions that you've described, but the data don't necessarily support that. And in fact, in many instances, the data suggests that there's a benefit to having those countdowns that goes beyond just telling pedestrians when to start and stop their crossings. And so from that respect, I think that the concern might be a little exaggerated, and that there is still an anticipation of a net safety benefit with red light cameras, even if there are no changes to the other ways in which the signals operate.
So the countdown actually may be an opportunity to educate, is what I'm hearing.
It could be viewed that way, right? It's additional information, and you hope that drivers, pedestrians, and others use it responsibly.
It's kind of similar to how we've moved to making sure that all the lights are red for at least a few seconds to make sure that no one's running to avoid collisions. That's been a good move. I've noticed that through engineering in the last little while. Okay, so moving this forward, we move this forward now. There's no going back, is there? We passed this in its entirety today. It goes to committee of the whole and council, and we're moving forward with negotiations. This resolution gives you the ability to negotiate. Does negotiations come back to council for approval, or committee of the whole, or this committee, or what's the process?
Through the chair, if it's approved today, staff will proceed with engaging those three parties for those contracts. And that would be it.
Yeah, we wouldn't see it again.
Through the
Okay.
chair, it's my understanding that no, it would not come to council again.
Okay, all right, thank you. And separate vote on item C, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Seeing no further speakers, we'll call the question. We'll do item C first.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. I didn't realize we're that far advanced. I do have a question
Yep,
regarding C, if I may.
Go ahead.
Through you to staff. Is the $600,000 in the budget already, or will it come to us as an unmet need at estimates?
Through the chair, it's not in the budget right now. Indy, maybe you want to take this one?
Yeah, through the chair. So it's not in the budget, it's a request to put it into the budget. It'd be an unmet need. So that's inclusive of staff as well. So any staff that encompasses staff needs or POA needs as well.
Okay, thank you, Indy. My concern is that we're looking at a 2% budget increase, which means we've got to find about $2.4 million in efficiencies. And as much as I support this, we can't have our cake and eat it at the same time. Will there be an opportunity to discuss this at the estimates?
Through you, Chair. Yes, that's where it would be presented. So we just like to get permission to bring it to estimates.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Brian, it's Jeff.
If I can just step in, and to Councillor Carpenter's question as well. If you read the motion, Councillor, that the staff to be directed and engaged. So item B, RLC contractor to begin the process of entering an RLC program. We're not entering a contract, Councillor Carpenter. We're beginning the process, and then this will also go as an unmet need. So you will see it again when we enter a contract. It's beyond our spending authority as well. You'll see it as an unmet need as well. So this will not be the last time you see this, Councillor Carpenter. It gets the ball rolling, gets us negotiating contract and gets us pricing and those sorts of things, and also will come in as an unmet need as well. Okay.
Will there be something in the budget as well for the revenue side of this? If it's anticipated to be revenue neutral.
So through the chair, or to you, Mr. Chair. So the first year is always the higher end capital costs. So we would have to achieve the revenue once the cameras are in. And if it's a 12 to 18 month period or 24-month period, we may see the revenues a year later, but the costs upfront.
Take a full year to install the full system?
Just to enter the agreements and get it in place, the timelines that were the 12 to 24-month time period to enter the agreements and get the approval of the sites from the vendor and get the infrastructure installed, et cetera, and get them up and running. So there's a lag there, but we would have to upfront some of that capital.
At what point would the money be required? Because the negotiations don't require money up front, do they?
Through the chair, I'll have to send that over to Matt to comment on the negotiation after in terms of when the money or the funding is required by the vendor, but I'll leave it to Matt or David maybe to answer that one.
Yeah, through the chair. So what the process would be once we have council approval, the first step would be to contact the MTO to arrange for the city of Brantford to be included into the regulations to be able to operate red light camera. Once we have that, they provide notification to the Joint Processing Center in Toronto. We would obtain the various agreements. The various agreements have been operating for quite some time. It had gone through a request for proposal. We've gone through all of that work. So there really is no negotiation, to be honest. It's all the costs are set and the information is provided. The only cost that really is a variable is with the Joint Processing Center, because how it operates is that it is a collection of the municipalities and the costs are distributed accordingly through the municipalities based on the number of cameras you operate. So that's sort of the only real negotiation. But essentially, it could move fairly quickly once we have approval. Like I said, the biggest issue will be dealing with the province because it does have to get a regulation change. And with an election coming next year, I believe, the province, we may run into some delays.
Okay, and one more question. If C fails, does that kill the rest of the resolution?
Through the chair, C speaks to putting it in the operating budget. So if we're not given direction to put it in the operating budget, we wouldn't be able to fund the program. So we wouldn't be able to install them.
Okay, and would it be possible to take out the word annual costs and just have it as a one-time cost? With the idea that revenues will, even if they lag a year, they'll cover the following year. Mr. Hutchings?
So if I can ask for some leniency, Mr. Chair, I know this is a task force and they do get a little bit more leniency. Just we don't normally act like this at council or committee of the wholes, but with my staff. Your original question, Councillor Carpenter, Chair Carpenter, was about revenues. If you look at item D, and we've gone through this presentation, we didn't dissect the recommendation. It does say that we correct revenues and put them in a reserve account for RLC violations, the sole use of road safety initiatives and cost recovery. Now, the staff have not estimated that. So there will be, back to your question, there will be cost recovery in the first year. It's just a timing issue. And I think we may have to go back and see what the cost will be in 2022 and what the timing is. So we haven't talked much about the revenue side. They talked about the expense side. So, and then to the second part is we still could, if C was defeated, we still this to give us the authority to go start negotiating. We wouldn't have the authority to enter into the unmet need into the budgets of item C, but we could still do some of the other things too. And with the remaining monies, I think there's still some actions we can take on item D and E, but and B as well. So I want to clarify that. I appreciate the leniency. So if that made any sense to you, there is revenues that we will collect. I think it's all timing, and we got to take the next step once we start negotiating what the timing is. And there's expenses we'll have. Yes, we'll have more upfront expenses, but we'll also have some revenues, and we'll have some more details when we get to the budget time, which is in January, to approve last night.
Okay, and a last comment, you might want to consider setting up a capital fund with a one-time contribution so that the revenues will then carry the ongoing costs. Councillor Vanderstout, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Hutchings. So there are indeed a number of different touch points after this decision is made today throughout the estimates process and the council approval process of the estimates committee. So I would assume that there would be at least 5 to 10 nights of deliberation on operational budget in estimates next spring, whereby we can decide whether or not we want to go ahead with this program. So there's plenty of touch points where the public has access to this information before we make the final decision, correct?
Correct.
Thank you so much.
Councillor Carpenter. You're on mute, Councillor Carpenter.
All right, yeah, I'm very happy with Brian Hutchings' explanation. I withdraw the separation of item C now. He's made it clear that we have options. Thank you.
Councillor Van Tilburg.
So just so I'm 100% clear, we pass this, the first thing we see is an unmet needs in when we come to estimates this fall.
It might come to us as a capital expense as well. Staff will have to review that. and
How do
see
we determine if it's capital or operating? Because it does say operating, it's an operating cost. So I'm a bit confused there. Is it an operating?
In the
cost or-
resolution right now, it's as an operating cost, but I've suggested that staff take another look at that. And when it comes to estimates, they can bring it as a capital expense to fund a reserve to cover off the initial costs and any deficits in the program going forward. And we may need to, years down the road, add a little more to that reserve, or it might grow and be utilized for other road safety measures.
Does that need to be written then into as an amendment to?
I think
with
direction
the
to staff.
flexibility?
I think direction to staff will suffice. They've heard our comments and they understand our concerns. And they know, Mr. Hutchings knows the budget process intimately, and I'm sure he'll figure out the best way to bring this forward.
Thank you.
Councillor Utley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to staff. Can somebody confirm that it takes 2 years to set up, or approximately 2 years to set up this program?
Dave, I don't know if you want to come on to speak to your experience on that.
I
Yes,
think I
through the-
read that in the report. Hi, Dave.
Yeah, through the chair, again, the biggest or longest time period is just the agreements. Once we have
Yeah.
those agreements approved, the process moves fairly quickly. We would contact the vendor will review the locations. So providing how smooth everything goes, you could see things in place late next year if it were
Okay.
approved.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, seeing no further questions or comments, and the separation request was withdrawn, we're voting on the entire resolution. So we'll call the question now. Show of hands, all in favor? Opposed? That carries. Okay, can I have a mover for the minutes and a seconder? Councillor Vanderstel, Councillor Utley. Any errors or omissions from the minutes? Seeing none, all in favor? Carried unanimously. And that's the end of our agenda. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Good job, Mr. Chair.
Thanks,
Thank
Greg.